Good morning. Go ahead and open your Bibles or turn it on to the book of Psalms. We'll be looking at Psalm number 55. While you're looking for that, let me welcome you back to our daily devotions. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving break with family or friends, or if nothing else, at least at the minimum, a nice break from all the cares of the world. This morning in Psalm number 55, we're going to read about David and his cares about the world. Now, the cares he mentions are non-specific in the sense that we can't identify a particular occasion or problem. I think he wrote it that way intentionally so that any one of us can read it, recognize the feelings, recognize the concerns, and be able to put ourselves in his shoes and say, been there, done that. And so this morning we're going to read another psalm of lament. Remember, laments are kind of a woe is me, but not woe is me in the terms of a poor, poor, pitiful me, a pity party for themselves. But laments are honest assessments of the situation, admitting your problem, acknowledging your concerns or your heartaches, and then crying out to God for intervention. And these psalms always include some sort of element of expectation of answer to the prayer, or even an acknowledgement of the worship that will come when God does, in fact, as expected, answer that prayer for you. This morning, again, we're in Psalm number 55, a little longer, so we'll read it all, and then we'll come back and hit a few highlights as we work our way through it. Verse 1, Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that if I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find shelter from the raging wind and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throng. Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is their dwelling place and in their heart. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from of old, because they do not change and do not fear God. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and treachery shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. Hopefully, as I read that aloud, you picked up on several patterns, several recurring themes. As we look at Psalm 55, we could point out to you, I think you can find it for yourself if I just make you aware of them. There are several times where David follows a pattern here. He begins with a cry of, I'm crying out to God in prayer. I'm praying. Then he begins to mention what his concern is. Talks about his enemy for a while. Then he stops and prays again. Specifically mentions God by name in the prayer. Then goes back into now more specific detail about the situation. Again, never so specific that we can say that this was such and such a situation. But he's gone from a broad concern now to a much more narrow concern. Then he again mentions God in prayer. Then again, the mention of the enemies. And then he closes with acknowledgement of his trust and faith in God. And so let's work our way through it. David begins, Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. And so the prayer begins with an acknowledgement that he is praying to God and needs God's help. Then he begins to go into the situation at hand. I am restless in my complaint and I moan, verse 3, because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. And so the enemy, whoever it is verbal here. It's not physical. David's not worried about combat or dying. Remember, David fought a lion once. David fought the Philistines. In one case, he fought Goliath single-handedly. But it's the noise, it's the constant complaint. Maybe it's the constant bickering. Maybe it's the constant lying in the background. Because of the oppression of the wicked, they're trying to beat David down with words. For they drop trouble upon me, he says in verse 3, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. They don't even forgive him. Things are not good. And then David acknowledges his heart. He says, my heart is in anguish within me, verse 4. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. He acknowledges this is an emotional response. Fear and trembling, he continues, come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. The situation, whatever it is so bad that David is heartbroken over it, heart-stricken. In fact, he goes on to admit, this great warrior for God, in verse 6, that if I had wings like a dove, I'd fly away. If he could get away from the situation, he would. If he could flee, he would do that very thing. He says, yeah, I would wander far away. I'd lodge in the wilderness. I'd hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and tempest. If there's any way out of the situation, David would have already taken it. But the predicament is such that there is no way out. There is no hope but God. So he cries again to God. And here's another return to the prayer language. Destroy, O God, divide their tongues. So here's what's called an imprecatory prayer, a prayer for God's vengeance on the enemy. Divide their tongues. Stop them from talking about me and against me, for I see violence and strife in the city. And then what he begins to describe next in this section of the psalm reads very much like the description of some of our more dangerous cities in the world today. I see violence and strife in the cities, verse 9. Verse 10, day and night they go around on its walls. Iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in the midst. Oppression, fraud, don't depart from the marketplace. The enemy does not taunt him. He says if that was the case, he could bear it. It's not an adversary who deals insolent with me, then I'd hide from him. Now he's zooming in very specific. Here comes a situation where it's very personal to David. Verse 13, but it is you, O man, a man, my equal. Now he's zooming closer. My companion. Now he zooms in closest. My familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng. So David's enemy here, the predicament, the situation that is at David's heartache at the moment, is not merely a group of people, his enemies waging war. It's not merely people talking about him in ways that are not true. It's a personal friend, a close confidant, somebody, in fact, that he says he used to walk in the temple with. It'd be as if one of your best friends from church all of a sudden turned on you, didn't turn on you over something reasonable, turned on you on something personal, and began to lie and to talk about you, to undermine your character in public. Imagine the deep grief, the heartache that comes with that. Some of you know it. Some of you have been there. Some of you, you've had family friends or maybe even your own children betray you in that sense. And you know the heartache and the grief that comes with knowing that the most personal of abandonment has taken place. And so David prays, verse 15, speaking specifically again to God, let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol, the grave. Sheol is not hell. Sheol is the grave. Let them go down to the Sheol alive. Why? Verse 15 continues, but evil is in for evil is in their dwelling place and in their heart. Again, he acknowledges prayer. Verse 16, I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Now we're beginning to sense that confidence that is in David's prayer. He doesn't pray hoping God will do something. He prays knowing that God can do something. And so evening and morning and at noon, he says, 3 times a day he's praying. I utter my complaint and I moan. He hears my voice. Again, so many times we've seen in the Psalms an acknowledgement that we have a prayer-hearing God. He redeems my soul in safety. For the battles that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. So God hears, God's aware, God knows. God will listen, verse 19. God will give ear and humble them, he who is enthroned from of old, because they do not change. They do not fear God. So he's crying out to God for intercession, and God will do what he believes. Now back to more details about the situation. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter. He's a silky talker, slick, yet war was in his heart. He said one thing, he meant another. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Now to all of us, David turns in the end of the psalm. Cast your burden on the Lord, David says, and he will sustain you. So he's already sustaining David. Now he's encouraging us in whatever our situation is today to cast our burdens on God because he'll sustain us also. He'll never permit the righteous to be moved. Now, this is not David promising that the righteous will never go through trouble. In fact, Jesus warns us of the same thing, but that ultimately the righteous will not be moved. They won't be taken away from God forever. They may struggle, they may deal with horrible circumstances, but know that ultimately the ones that God holds in his hand, he'll never lose one. And then finally in verse 23, he turns back to God. But you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destruction. These men of blood and treachery, they shall not live out their days, he ends the psalm. But I will trust in you. I don't know all of your circumstances. I don't know what's going on in your world, whether you live here in Charleston or somewhere far around the world in Kenya or beyond. But I know that God knows. He's aware. He hears your prayers. And as David reminds us, he can answer them. And then as David also promises us, even if he doesn't answer them the way that you want or in the time that you want, ultimately God will answer them for all of eternity. He'll never lose you. He'll never leave you nor forsake you, as Jesus promised. He'll keep you to the end, and then he'll bring you to his side for all of eternity. Cry out in faith to God and trust him to do what you cannot.